Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. I recently was reminded of a person I became familiar with a couple years ago named Lizzie Velasquez. There was a Facebook meme that was going around with a little video of her talking about her experience. And I think she's got a TED Talk now, and if you Google her name, you'll find all sorts of resources. But her story is essentially that she has a physical disability she was born with that essentially prevents her from being able to create fat on her body. And it affects her weight, it affects her heart, and it affects her eyes. I think she's blind in one eye. It impacts her heart, and she's just unable to create body fat effectively. So it's also relatively dangerous. Back in 2012, there was another meme going around that had found a picture of her that called her the ugliest woman in the world. And it ended up on YouTube, and it ended up getting millions of views and hits. And she was 17 years old at the time that it happened. So she talks about her experience of running into this YouTube video at the age of 17, discovering that, as far as she was concerned, the internet was calling her the ugliest woman in the world. And she was 17. So already, the story for me is heartbreaking. But she decided, she said, at that moment when she was scrolling through all of the comments, and she said that she scrolled through every single one of the thousands of comments looking for somebody to defend her, and she didn't find one. And she said that she looked over at her mom. She was sitting in her room, and the door of her room was open, and she could see her mom through the door. And her mom was watching TV, and she thought, if this is breaking my heart, what's it going to do to my mom? Which already, I think, shows that she has an amazing disposition and that she was already concerned about the people in her life when she's going through what might be possibly one of the worst experiences a 17-year-old girl can go through.
How do you recover from that? Seriously, that's just incredible.
Yeah, it's awful. So she said that it was at that moment that she decided that she wasn't going to let anybody else define her. She was going to be the only person who was allowed to define herself. And a little bit later, she got contacted to give a talk. And when she gave a talk to people, she was super shy. And she said she couldn't look up from her talk until about halfway through. And she noticed that all the students that she was giving this talk to were dead silent, and some of them were crying, whereas she expected them to not really be paying attention to her. And from then on began her very empowering career of talking about her experience and talking about not allowing other people to define you. So I've always had an admiration for Lizzie Velasquez, and I highly recommend looking her up and looking up her TED Talk. But that prompted a conversation between you and me, Joel, about who do we allow to define us?
Yeah, we've talked about this a lot here at Personality Hacker, whether they've been articles or podcasts about setting your own vision for your life, about defining your life for yourself. And I think we're going to take a little different tack today, give some practical thoughts around it. And when we're talking about this, I actually had some hesitation about using her as a specific example because it's such a powerful example that it's easy to make the conversation around something like if you have an extreme disability, or if you have something. There's another guy we watch, Zach Anner, he has MS, I think, and he's in a wheelchair, and he's a motivational speaker. He does really great YouTube videos. And when you're dealing with something, maybe an extreme case, it can be easy to say, well, yeah, those people have extreme situations. And to bring people like that into the conversation here, weirdly enough, you'd think it would be more connective and be able to make more patterns from it. But sometimes we can be dismissive when we talk about these kind of people because they have such, just like if a movie star or an athlete, they have such a different experience than the rest of us. It's easy to dismiss that. So the conversation today is around, you may not be in a situation where you are super talented or super athletic or super blessed in certain ways. And you may not also have a situation where you have a lot of challenges like this young woman has. You're somewhere in the middle. And so where does this conversation fall for you listening? How do you make sense of it? Because it's easy to dismiss those two extremes.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's nice about situations like Lizzie's or Zach's or Sean Stevenson, who's another person who we love, people in these situations help create some perspective. oh, well, maybe if they can overcome some of their struggles, I can overcome some of my struggles. But then there can also be a sense of like guilt and the sense of, well, if their struggles are so extreme and they're able to get through them with such extraordinary grace, or at least appearance of grace, because I'm sure it's a struggle for them all the time, then maybe I shouldn't think of any of my problems as being problems. And so we can marginalize ourselves in those situations. I think that those people are still highly inspirational, but like you said, a part of it might not be as relatable to everybody else who's falling inside the bell curve. So what we really wanted to focus on, though, instead of just this concept of people who are inspirational or not or whatever, I just wanted to hone in on Lizzie's statement, I'm not going to allow other people to define me, which is such a powerful statement no matter who you are. But then as you and I were talking about it, Joel, we went, okay, so that's a nice platitude, right? Like it's the platitude that I get to define who I am and nobody else, gets to. But how do you actually make that happen? How does one take control of defining themselves in a world that gives us constant feedback about who we should be according to its perspective? If it continually projects onto us an identity, how do we create enough space to actually wrestle control back and decide, no, I actually get to do that, not you?
It's made more complicated too, because if everyone else in your world is bought into, quote unquote, the reality that you're experiencing, it's very easy. I don't care how free thinking you might be. It's very easy just to fall into, okay, this is how things work. This is the reality of the situation. Kind of on a funny note, we were actually laughing last night. We were driving this rural area on a back road, and I noticed a sign for deer crossing here in the United States. We have a lot of white-tailed deer in the state of Pennsylvania where we live. And I was remembering this radio show that a woman called into. It was actually like this clip online that we had heard. This woman called into a radio show, and she was complaining to the radio DJs on this like morning show somewhere about why do they keep putting deer crossing signs in some of the worst places along the freeway or along the highway.
Like the busiest places.
Yeah, some of the busiest places. Like, why don't they put the deer crossing signs in places where they're back roads or the deer can cross safely without getting hit? And in her mind, it was as if the deer, and we make fun of it, like, oh, this woman might not be that intelligent, or she doesn't know how things work. And it's a fun thing to laugh at, but the reality of it is she thinks that deer look for those signs to find where to cross the road, right? Like she sees the sign, the deer crossing sign that some government agency put up, and it's such a reality for her that somebody somewhere, an authority figure, put this deer sign up. That must be because they need to tell the deer where to go, because that's what signs mean to her. When she drives along, she looks for signs to know what her cues are of what to do in the world, right? So she assumes that's why these signs are put up for the deer as well. And it's funny to kind of think about and chuckle to yourself, like, how could somebody be not making those connections and think that's how deer experience the world? And Antonia's actually laughing right now because it's probably so absurd to you. But if you think about this, a lot of us in life are going through our lives not realizing that everything that we engage with is a construction to some degree by somebody or some body of people. It's not like we're just going through a reality that's not constructed for us. So I think you're still laughing. I'm hoping you can recover and come back to the podcast in a moment. It just speaks to me to say that what the world we go through, it's like a fish in water. It's hard for the fish to understand what water is. Our experience in the world, the construction, the social construction of our experience in the world feels so real. It feels so visceral. It feels almost unquestionable. How do you show up in the world and define yourself when the world might be defining you in a specific way? How do you show up in the world and take that definition for your own self when everything around you is constructed to reinforce a reality in a certain fashion that you're like, I don't know if this is my reality, but it just feels so right. It feels so strong. It feels so compelling.
One of the reasons why that clip is so funny is because she's irate about it.
She's upset.
She's like,
why would the government do this to us?
Well, to the poor deer.
Yeah.
Why would the government do that to the deer? She's just righteously indignant about it. And
the DJs play along the whole time.
Talk about naive reality. Like, talk about a level of naive reality that's like, I mean, it's not exactly naive reality, but it's like, it's taking that to an extreme. But that said, as hilarious and as what delightfully absurd as my introverted thinking process finds that. Like, my introverted thinking finds that so delightfully absurd. And every time I think about it, it makes me laugh. But I think, to speak to your point, Joel, we accept reality as reality in a way that becomes absurd, right? I mean, we do that. And so we've had a lot of podcasts talking about, like, make sure that you're not buying into this reality too much. Make sure that, you hold a little bit of perceptual reality in there as well. I think we just had a podcast about it, maybe 4 podcasts ago. That said, the flip side is, okay, so let's say that I take control back and I start to, really take control of framing my own identity or determining my own identity. And is that the end of the story? Or do I need to maybe get good at that? Like, is that a skill we develop, or is that something we just come with? Like, the only fight is to claw identity away from society and bring it back to ourselves. Is that the end of it? Is that the end of the struggle? Or is there more to the story? And you and I feel like there's more to the story. We can take control back for crafting our identities and then just be really terrible at crafting our identities. So I think of IFPs in the Myers-Briggs system, people who use introverted feeling. I think people who use introverted feeling might be the best at taking their identity back for themselves. And I think the reason why is, I think it's rooted in why we hand power over to society in the first place. Now, you talked about how we just accept the world's reality that's given to us and we don't often question it. But I think a part of the reason why it makes total sense to me, and that is, every single human being is ridiculously complex. Every person would take a lifetime to self-discover. And even then, at the end of your life, you're not done. You've just done a lot more than everybody else because you had more time. But that's us discovering ourselves. That's not discovering another person. Like, we could never possibly understand the complexity of another human being. And we know that. So in order to be able to have, say, a conversation with another person, we have to oversimplify who they are. We have to take markers about who we think they might be and put them into boxes and categories and gross oversimplifications in order to just have a relationship with them. So we use markers like their gender and their race and the culture they come from and maybe their socioeconomic class and how attractive they are or how unattractive they are. We use a lot of these categories, these gross oversimplifications, in order to just be able to have a relationship with someone. Because if you felt like you had to know everything about them in order to have, to have any sort of relationship with them, we wouldn't even say hi to anybody. We'd have like 4 people in our life that we were able to say hi to. Everybody else would be a complete and total mystery. So we do that out of just basically social survival. We have to oversimplify each other. We have to create these categories. And that's one of the reasons why you and me and the listener are all into Myers-Briggs. That's one of the reasons why we're into typology systems, because they give us more sophisticated categories that are more accurate and help us understand each other in better, more highly crafted categories, because we know we have to put each other and ourselves in categories just as a starting point. So we know that that's how things work. That's why we're into type, because we want to have the best categories possible. So that said, because we create these categories and because we have this sense of reality that we just buy into and hand a lot of our power over, we end up overvaluing those categories and seeing them as true. And when the world puts us in one of those categories, we go, because we honor the categories so much ourselves, because they're such a helpful tool for us as well, we give these categories a lot of power. And so when somebody goes, oh, you're in the ugly category, we go, oh, that's not good. I don't want to be in the ugly category. Oh, that's what the world's saying, though. I must be there. Or whatever. Or we're in the attractive category. Yes, huzzah, cool. I'm in the attractive category. Awesome. Whew, dodged a bullet there. we value these categories, and then we overvalue these categories, and then we let the world put us in them, and then we go, okay, that must be who I am. So I think the first step is recognizing why the categories happen to begin with. And I started this out by talking about IFPs, people who use introverted feeling. And my suspicion is this is the reason why IFPs have a tendency, not always, but they have a greater tendency than many types to reject Myers-Briggs, reject personality typology systems, because they don't want to be put in any category. They've spent so much time introspecting and so much time getting to know who they are as an individual. They know that they're too complex to be able to put into a category. They know that about themselves. And so they don't create as many of these categories for themselves. And so therefore they're more in touch with, and they have an easier time of basically rejecting society's boxes. They won't be put into a box. But here might be the rub for people of these types. And that is, do we teach people skills? Do they have any skills or tools when they're taking their identities back to do a good job with that? And I think we do ourselves and society a disservice in general, but not giving anybody tools for like actually creating our own identities well, not just creating them, not just having that power, but doing it well, which is why I think a lot of IFPs are simultaneously racked with self-doubt and insecurity. Like they won't let the world tell them who they are, but when they tell themselves who they are, now they don't feel so good.
Yeah. I see an emergence of this attempt. I see it from, and I'm going to get down to, maybe somebody's going to get me in trouble, but I'll just break it down by gender right now. A lot of times what I see when people are trying to define themselves, when I see men online, for example, let's just say Facebook, let's use that as an example. When men are trying to define themselves, it's not a lot of positive talk. It's usually something about, and I've fallen into this too, something about an accomplishment or something that will give a sense of empowerment. It's not as direct as I think females do it. So when males do it, it seems more around like maybe a meme they post around strength and power and empowerment or dominance, or, sometimes there's like an ethos of militarism behind it or something like that, like force or something that's really, like I got this really powerful truck I drive, or I've got this, this stance I have that's a power stance in that kind of way. And I feel it like it's an attempt for males to try to define themselves, not allow society to define them. And often what's weird about it is they're picking caricatures or pre-contextualized elements, like a big truck, for example. I know some males in my life who might post a picture, they get a new truck, and that's their definition is this new big pickup truck that's really got a lot of horsepower, and that's how they're defining, right? Through this thing that they're trying to make their own for self-definition, but it was still something that they took off the shelf. And I see what females often do, and this is a much more direct way that I think females do it. I see these posts of, I'm a goddess. I should be respected by everyone because I'm a goddess. I am the full manifestation of the energy flowing through the universe. And a lot of these kind of messages it's very rare that you see a male post that, but a lot of females will post those. So I see both genders looking to, and I think those are somewhat pulled off the shelf to some degree. It's not like they thought this up. This might be resonating, but it's something that was maybe given to them or they saw somewhere that, this is something I can define myself with. I'm not picking on anybody. I found myself and you, both of us have fallen into posting things to show, especially in a context like social media, like Facebook, here's how I'm defining myself. So please don't take this as me picking on either one of those. That's not the point of what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is we have a drive as humans to want self-definition. Some of us are more direct about it. We're using the verbalization of the words to try to create that in the world outwardly. And other of us use maybe products or embodiment of certain styles or things to showcase that more illustratively. But I think we all do it in some way because this is somewhat of a natural, from my perspective, a natural human need is to, we were watching this thing on ancient Rome and Greece last night. And people, just everyday people on their tombstones were carving things about their lives, what they did in their work and who they were and what part of the city or world they were from. We have this human need to put our mark on the world, to define ourselves, to be something special. Did our life matter is what we ask ourselves on a core unconscious way. And I think all of these things are attempts to showcase, yes, my life matters. And we get caught up in defining ourselves by the things we're handed, whether the things we say or the things we do. But ultimately, it's a drive we have. And I think it speaks to say that you're right. I think IFPs have spent a lot of time looking at this, that lead with that authenticity or introverted feeling process. And sometimes that could be a reaction that I see not just with IFPs, but other people. You can't define me. I'm this, whatever. I'm the goddess, or I'm a masculine male, or I've got this product or service or stance or job that defines me. And we almost posture with it in some ways. So I think there needs to be some sense of when we want to reclaim this natural thing that we want to reclaim, which is how we define ourselves, what do we do? What do we tether ourselves to? Do we find platitudes and statements about being a goddess or something and we showcase those? Or do we find a product or some kind of an embodiment that we can illustrate who we are by what we own or what we do? Or are there ways we can think about this and contextualize this principle-wise that has nothing to do with the things we post on social media as an example, that we can start to define ourselves around and use frameworks, models, and tool sets in our social technology to do that rather than all these things that I see emerging all over the place?
So I think a big piece of this is as well. I mean, of course, our self-definition, just like everything, will be the emergent of an entire system running. A big node in that system is how well we know ourselves. And for those of us that are into models of human development, I think that's one of the reasons why we pursue those so much, so we can get a guide to understanding components of who we are better. Like, I'm not an IFP or an EFP. I don't use introverted feeling, so introspection is not as easy for me. I'm using introverted thinking as an ENTP to understand who I am, and so that means that I'm going to take more of a almost like an academic approach to it. But I'm going to use a lot of maps and models to help guide my way. And I think people who use introverted feeling can do that too. I think people who of all types can do that, and we can see that by our audience. That is, that they're attracted to some of these maps and models that we talk about. So how we see ourselves and how we reclaim our identity is in some part going to be influenced by, say, what level we're at in the Graves model. If we're a Graves level 4, that means, or a spiral dynamics blue, that means that we are probably going to have a lot of our identity around the social construct that we're attached to or the institutions we're attached to. And that's not inappropriate. I think going ahead and identifying with, the country you're from or a religious institution that you're a part of, or maybe being a social justice warrior if it's not a religion or patriotism, like whatever group you identify with, it makes sense that that would be part of your identity. I don't think that that's necessarily allowing society to tell you who you are. You're still telling yourself who you are. You're just doing it by understanding that you're part of something bigger.
You're part of a collective. Yeah,
exactly. You're still self-identifying. You're just now part of something else as well. And I don't think that that's handing your power over necessarily. Now, if you let the collective tell you who you are in the way that they say you're not allowed to be something within this collective and you have to obey, now you are handing yourself over to society again as to who you are. But if you're part of a collective that wouldn't do that to you, then you're probably okay. And if you are higher in the Graves levels or lower on this, what's called the spiral, if you are higher or lower, then it's going to be different how you're identifying yourself. But that's going to be a node in the system. I think some of the biggest nodes, though, are the tools we build, not just the understanding and awareness nodes. There's plenty of those. There's Myers-Briggs, Graves model, spiral dynamics, Enneagram, name 100 different personality models. So all of those are nodes in the system. But I think the more interesting ones are not the diagnostic tools, but the prescriptive tools. The tools and skills that we build as we are learning who we are more and more to get better at crafting who we're going to become and getting better at how we talk to ourselves and how we communicate with ourselves and how we are not just seeing who we are, but crafting who we are and feeling all the benefits of that. which is a greater sense of empowerment and security and knowing you can make things happen and really taking control of your identity. Not just being able to passively observe it and study it, but actually taking control of your identity in the sense that now you can, like, it doesn't have you by the balls, you have it by the balls. Like, it's not it's serving you now. Your identity is serving you, you're not serving it.
That sounds so weird, right? Like if you're listening and you're like, my identity's serving me. Well, I thought I am my identity. What are you talking about? I think there is some separateness in your mind between who you are and the identity you bring to the world. The identities, from what I can understand, what you're saying is how I think I'm perceived and how I think I'm defining myself and how others are defining me, which you would see as separate from who you actually are at the core of your being.
Well, I mean, I do go on and on about that thing called ego transcendence. I think our identity is found in our ego, and that is the part of me that wants to live. It's the part of me that is overwhelming. It's the part of me that gets up in the morning and makes breakfast and, you know, shows up to work and does podcasts. And I mean, that's my ego, and my identity lives in my ego. So I don't think that's the full story, though. And I have done enough ego transcendence work, and as we've mentioned in previous podcasts, psychedelics, so that I have been able to see the part of me that isn't attached to my ego, which is what we call the watcher. And so I have been able to be in the watcher, and I'm able to get there often enough and frequently enough to recognize that Antonia isn't the complete story. Antonia is the ego. And I can craft Antonia, and I can have Antonia serve Antonia. Like, it would still be serving itself, but it wouldn't be something that is in such overwhelming blind control that I am merciless to whatever machinations Antonia wants.
Yeah.
Like, I can be, like, it can also be a tool that I craft, my identity. And it can be something that I have self-aware control over.
And I think the reason why I wanted to highlight that is it speaks to this nature that helps with the prescription element, which is that I don't believe that identity is static. It's not that I am something. It's not that I embody something or I am this thing. My identity is this. It's that I am ing, I-ing in the English language. In other words, it's a verb. It's I am Joel-ing. All the time. I'm not Joel because I'm not what I was yesterday. And today I won't be the same person that I am tomorrow. I'm continually evolving my identity at all times. So when we talk about defining who we are as people, part of this is coming to the realization that it's not a static definition. And you might say, well, I kind of get that because I used to define myself this way. Now I define myself this way. But what we're actually saying here is that you're continually in the eternal now, which is kind of a weird concept, right? But the eternal now, which is the only thing you can actually experience, is the eternal now, because now is all you have. There is no past. There is no future as far as you can experience it. You're experiencing right now, listening to my voice in this very moment, eternally, right now in this moment. You are becoming your identity. You're continually either reinforcing elements of that or adding new elements in. And it's just like any organism that continually morphs and changes over time. You are becoming your identity. You are in your identity at all times. It's not a static thing. It's a dynamic thing. So I think that's the first fundamental piece in the prescription part here, is to realize identity is not who you are. It's who you are-ing at all times. It's kind of a little bit mind-bending if this is the first time you've heard a concept like this. But if you sit with that and think with it for a few minutes, maybe a few days, a few months, it might take a while for it to really get in there. It could be a little bit of a mind mess up because you're like, wait a minute, like that means I'm always evolving. Like you could literally become a different person in 30 seconds than you are now. We have so much wiring and things that would destabilize us. That's the reason we don't do that. But that flexibility, the plasticity of your mind is there enough with enough effort and attention put to it that the definition of who you are can be constantly evolving. So I just want to make a point to that based on what you said about separating out your ego from what you called the watcher and that ego transcendence work.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction to make or clarification to make. And I think the other thing that I would add to it, I hadn't really thought about it until you started talking about it, but I think one of the reasons why we resist that concept of the I aming and that I'm a plastic creature that can change and morph not just over time, not just, oh, I've grown and I have new experiences, and so therefore I've become wiser and different because of my experiences, but that I can actually be changing myself in the moment and altering how I see things and altering who I am and how I show up. The world gives us a lot of messages that that's not okay. They value something called consistency to a point where they make it a virtue and indicate that if you change, you are somehow inconsistent. And that's,
or immoral sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes. Well, if you turn consistency into a virtue, then being inconsistent would be a vice. And I suspect the reason why the world gives us that message is because it doesn't want us to change. It just learned how to manipulate us as we are. So if we change and we take control over our identity, then other people have far less ability to manipulate us because they don't know what they're dealing with moment to moment. So then we say consistency is super duper important. And I think it's like a subtle social contract we create with each other to ensure that we're all highly manipulatable. That's my personal opinion.
Well, and there is value to that. I mean, if you want to have a civilization, you have to have some predictability and expectation of etiquette, manners, decorum, communication styles, language. You have to have some of that in order to move. If everybody's evolving themselves so rapidly all the time, it would be utter chaos. So some of that is stabilization, and it's needed.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And yet, that would be creating an identity around how you treat other people, which I don't know if that's the best way to wrestle your identity, like the control of your identity back, by simply saying that like etiquette is a part of your identity. Now, etiquette can be one of your core values, and your values are a part of your identity. But I think other values are even more powerful, like things like kindness. If everybody's kind, we don't really need etiquette because everybody will be behaving in a way that's kind. That's my personal opinion on the importance of kindness. But that said, when you are trying to take your identity back, I wouldn't really worry about civilization ending because the world has given you a bunch of messages around consistency. Like you taking your identity back and seeing it as plastic and understanding that you can be as inconsistent as you want to as you rest into what is authentic and true for you, it's not going to crumble society. Despite how many messages you get that you are undermining everything for everyone. And that will be a very subtle, unconscious message, but you will get some of those messages. The world doesn't really want you to get out of your clean categories. Again, we create those categories for a reason because people are too complex. And if people continue to be massively complex, then that puts an extra burden on us to figure those complexities out. Most of us don't really want to do that. But while you are wrestling control back of your identity from the world, don't worry about that. That's everybody else's problem, not yours. You don't have to worry about that. So one of the major pieces, I think, or one of the major tools when we're talking about prescription on taking your control of your identity back is how are you talking to yourself? How you talk to yourself is one of the most powerful ways to craft your identity and how you see it. And there are some very important self-talk strategies that nobody really teaches you. Because again, I think we create some sort of virtue out of talking harshly to ourselves, as if that's going to somehow make us more humble, or it's going to make us more modest to say crappy things to ourselves and about ourselves, which it actually ends up doing the opposite, because the worse we feel about ourselves, the more self-obsessed we are. So if we can create really good habits around our self-talk and not buy into this BS that we're supposed to be like insecure, or we're supposed to say shitty things about ourselves to ourselves because that somehow makes us a better person. If we can really master that skill, we actually find ourselves becoming the best version of ourselves and resting into that integrity. So I actually, if you wouldn't mind, Joel, I think you should speak to this because I think you've created a really powerful strategy of how you talk to yourself while you're journaling.
Sure. Well, one as you were saying that, one thing that comes up for me that I've had this natural wiring, I guess. I don't know what it is. I've always taken things when there's advice given. It's very easy to say, other people should do such and such, whatever that advice is. Automatically, somehow, I don't know why I do this, but I automatically put myself like I in there. I, blah, 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 should do this thing, whatever that advice might be. So I instantly personalize it. Now, that might be because of my personality type. I use that process we talked about earlier, authenticity. Everything's about being personal, about value alignment, about what resonates with me on a core level. So part of this is my wiring, but I think it's a helpful tool that it's so easy when you read advice to say, oh man, yeah, my dad needs to hear this advice, or, oh yeah, if only my friend would take this advice to heart, this would really help them with their relationships. It's so rare when we say that to ourselves, especially if it's something we think we're really good at, to look at and say, I need to take this advice. I need to be better at this thing. I need to put myself here and make it about how you can improve, not just about having something that you can tell other people to improve upon. So that's one thing that I think can really help. Weirdly enough, I think that helps us define ourselves more, because it gives us a sense of us showing up to the table and how we're talking about our involvement with things we're learning and things that we're growing around.
Well, and I think basically what it does is it prevents us from projecting ourselves onto others, which is what we have a tendency to do. If we are making should statements and they're always should statements that are going out to other people, that's projection. Those should statements are actually statements we're making about ourselves to ourselves, but we're projecting them onto others. Taking control of your identity means stopping that process, stopping making everybody else a part of your identity in some way, either by handing them the power of crafting it or projecting our identity onto them in some way. Like, you just kind of remove other people from the equation as you're wrestling control back for yourself.
Yeah, but bringing that work back into your own workshop, where that personal growth work needs to happen, is so powerful, I think, in this. And so then the other thing that I've been really working at the last few years that is something that's really helped me is when I'm thinking, when I'm talking, or when I'm writing about something. And often this comes down to when I'm journaling, because that's when I'm doing what I call narrative casting. I'm trying to cast into the world or create into the world a narrative that I'd like to see happen. I'll be very careful about how I say things. So as an example, this isn't something that, well, this is something that this is a basic example, right? And I'm going to say this in the way that I think the reality is, and then I'm going to spin it into a way where I could make it more empowering. As an example, this isn't something I necessarily struggle around. It's my perspective. So first of all, I just did already a technique that I do. I just said it's my perspective. I didn't make an absolute statement, but let me just get away from my perspective, because I just messed that up by doing it that way. I'm a terrible parker. When I go into a parking lot at like a shopping center or a movie theater or somewhere where I have to park, I'm terrible at it. I don't park straight. I'm not very good at finding spots. It stresses me out. For some reason, I perceive myself as a very good driver. I just did it again. I gave a context of, I'm a very good driver. I'll say it with absolute statements. But when I get to a parking lot, I'm not a very good parker. I don't do it well. I'm terrible at it. So I end up just parking way far away from the building and then walking to the building. Now that is a way to see my abilities when I'm going somewhere to park my vehicle in that absolute way. I'm bad at this. A different way that you could do this is you could loosen it a little bit. You could say something like, it's my perspective, it's my experience that I'm not that great at parking. So I've already loosened this absolute statement. I've given it some more plasticity to how I define myself around parking my vehicle in a parking lot. I'm already doing modifiers to say, well, it's my perspective. Other people might perceive me as an amazing parker. They might see me as somebody that's really good at that, but it's my perspective. It's how I see myself that I'm not that great at parking. So that's like one step better than an absolute statement that I suck at parking. I'm terrible at parking. Taking that one step further is seeing if there's a way you can take that phrase that you're defining yourself with and cast a narrative for yourself that you would like to be the reality. So if you have a thought in your mind, I'm a terrible parker, you can loosen it, make it more plastic by saying it's my experience or my perception that I'm really bad at this thing, which is parking a vehicle in a parking lot. What I could do if I'm journaling about this, which is something I haven't done because this is not that big of an issue in my life, it's just an example. I could phrase it into say, I am learning how to become an amazing parker, with my car every day as I practice. So now I've created a positive frame of the thing that I want to become good at. Instead of defining myself in how bad I am at something, or even just loosening it and saying it's my perception that I'm bad at this, which is a step up, I'm going to the next level, which is I'm defining myself by who I'm becoming around this issue that I feel that I've got struggle around. And you could do this with anything in your life. I'm doing it just now as an example around parking my vehicle in a parking lot. You could do this around your relationship with your lover. You could do this around your educational experience, about your intelligence. You could do this around whatever it is that you have a very static definition of in your life. You can rephrase that in how you speak to yourself and how you write things down into the world of how you want things to be in a much more empowering frame. Now, this is nothing new, right? A lot of personal growth teachers will tell you positive self-talk. And sometimes there's not the technique on exactly how to do it. So I think that's what we're really hitting on today is this technique of rephrasing things. And it takes some discipline to do. Like I still go in, I'll sit down in my journal at night to write down certain things. And I might have something I'm working on or struggling with, and I might start writing it out. And then I'll say, okay, how can I rewrite that in a more empowering way? And I'll scratch it out. And then I'll try to rewrite it where it's a much more flexible, empowering, going for what I want rather than sticking me to where I am in a static framework.
Yeah. I've got one to add to that.
Yeah, please.
Which is going back to the idea of why we oversimplify and put ourselves in categories, and we do it to other people because we have to in order to engage with others and feel like we have any mastery at all on who they are. We have to make these gross categorizations. But we don't have to do that for ourselves, and yet that's all the training we get. We get trained to think in those ways. But when it comes to ourselves, we can dive into the complexity of who we are all we want, which includes the concept of context or our conditions. And I think I have an example that I literally just engaged in that I want to use to talk about context.
Good.
And in particular, cutting yourself some slack when you see yourself having bad habits or things that you don't feel like are the best parts about your identity, like seeing those things and acknowledging them for what they are, but then kind of cutting yourself some slack because there's always a level of complexity around all of this. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. I have been a nail biter since I was a baby. I never remember a time period in my life where I didn't bite my nails. Up until about 3 weeks ago, when I all of a sudden decided I was no longer going to bite my nails. And I did the things that I felt I should probably do in order to encourage myself to no longer bite my nails. I painted them. I've been keeping them consistently painted. And I discovered that if my pinky nail is long, then it makes me bite all of my nails. And so I've got to keep my pinky nails really short. So I keep those super duper short, and I'm allowing the rest of my nails to grow out to a point where I can handle them. But I just literally chewed every single one of my nails while you were talking, Joel. Like every single one.
I watched you.
For the first time in like almost a month, I just chewed my nails. And I thought, I'm back to being a nail biter. And then as you were talking, I was like, why did I chew my nails? Why for the first time in a month did I chew my nails? And I realized it's because they got too long. They got so long that they bother me. And so the actual way that I'm going to do the self-talk is not that, crap, I'm a nail biter again. Here I am. I bite my nails. I'm a nail biter. I'm contextualizing it to, I am a nail biter if my nails get too long. And I'm even going to switch that up to, I bite my nails if my nails get too long. And so I'm not going to identify as a nail biter anymore because that just keeps the process going. I have to be consistent with my identity, right? And if I identify as a nail biter, which I've done my entire life, I'm going to keep, in order to maintain integrity with who I am and how I see myself, I'm going to continue to bite my nails to stay in integrity. Well, that's kind of stupid. So I'm going to detach my habit from my identity by saying not that I am a nail biter, but that I have a tendency to bite my nails when they get too long and I haven't clipped them. So in order to prevent that from happening again, I have to stay on top of clipping them. It's something that I have to build a new habit around because as a person who used to bite my nails, I never had to clip them. So I just don't think about it. And now I will think about it and I will create the new habit of clipping my nails. Good. Very, very simple, very easy, but create some context around the situation.
Let's work on that for a second, though.
Okay.
If you want to play for a second live on the air, here we go.
Let's do it.
See if we screw this up. So you just did a definition of, you say the phrase again, what you said.
I have a tendency to bite my nails if I allow my nails to get too long.
So that's better than where you were because it's not super definitional. You're not defining yourself as a nail biter. I have a tendency to bite my nails if. So you have X if equals this thing, right? So this stuff happens. If that happens, then I end up biting my nails. Is there a way we could rephrase that? Is there a way you could rephrase that to cast forth the narrative of what is the desired outcome you have? Because the desired outcome is not biting your nails. That's not a positive outcome. That's taking something away. Biting the nails is the action. What is the thing that you're going to replace? It's because it's not reducing. It's going to add something different. So you're basically directing yourself to a different way of defining yourself. And this might take a little bit of work. Again, we're doing this live on the air, so we might screw this up. But how can you define yourself in what you're going toward rather than what you're going away from?
Well, I guess that means that I have to get really clear on why I've stopped biting my nails.
Yeah, like what is the desired outcome?
Right. What is the intent? And I think a part of it is like overall health. I guess I've gotten the message that nail biting is an unhealthy practice. And it is, because when I was a kid, I used to get like ringworm and stuff because I would touch stuff and then I would bite my nails. It's super gross. But as an adult, I'm a lot more conscientious about cleanliness and hand cleanliness. So that hasn't happened as an adult, but it still kind of makes me pause and go, maybe I shouldn't be doing that. So I think it's like an overall health thing. I think it's also actually the bigger piece is proving to myself that I have the discipline to do it. It's a matter of self-discipline. So I think that's probably the closest thing I would be going towards is self-discipline.
So this is just a first stab in the dark, but could you say something like, I am a self-determined and disciplined woman who, whatever, like, go ahead.
I am a self-disciplined woman who makes sure that I clip my nails on a regular basis to keep good habits going.
Yeah. And so then it's not about what you're not doing. It's about what you are doing. And it's more of a positive framework. Like your identity now starts to see yourself, oh, I'm a disciplined woman and I am the type of person that clips my nails. And that makes me healthy and feeling better about myself overall. And so you're casting the narrative forward positively. I think that's a great way to say it. Yeah.
And I think it also, I think the reason why I said it the first way, which is I bite my nails when, is I think that was me cutting myself some slack. So that wasn't about my identity. It was more about ensuring that I don't treat myself too harsh when I am out of alignment with the identity I'm trying to create.
Well, and also, and this comes down to personality type a little bit. You and I are different personalities. Your introverted thinking or accuracy process is looking for leverage points. And you've determined that a leverage point is if I keep my pinky nail short, everything else cascades from there. As long as those are short, I typically won't bite the rest of my nails. And that's a leverage point. And that's what you're looking for. So in that statement, it was a really good statement. I'm not saying it was bad. It's the statement where you identified the leverage point. So that's important to go through that process too, especially for you as an introverted thinking person. Leverage points are how you gain power. And I think each type has one of these things. And then ultimately, after you get that leverage point, whatever is unique for your type, obviously, then you can go in the narrative casting of creating the prescription of what you want to be the reality rather than just going away from the thing you don't want.
Well, and I think we're talking about two slightly different parts of the process as well.
Yeah.
One of them is the self-talk that allows for the complexity of life to be a part of why things are happening, like understanding that you and everything that's happening in your world is the emergent or the result of a system running. And it's not just I'm a bad person or I lack self-discipline or whatever, and that's why I bit my nails. Like it's the self-talk that acknowledges the complexity of your reality enough to cut yourself some slack sometimes, to go, not everything is just I'm out of alignment or I am, I'm not a self-disciplined person. The first part is there's a lot going on. And so I need to acknowledge that it's not that I'm bad or wrong or I need to think of myself in negative terms. I can acknowledge that there are certain things happening, some of which is like a test iterate. For me, I didn't know that when my nails got too long, I was going to bite them. This is the first time they've ever gotten too long. I've never had my nails get too long before. I've always bitten them. So I was like, oh, so they get to a point where they drive me crazy. and I'm stuck at a microphone right now. I don't have the ability to go get clippers. And apparently everything in my body felt that it was massively urgent that my nails no longer be long, right? Like that's a thing. And I bit them in response. Okay, this is test iterate. I'm figuring it out. It doesn't mean that I'm a massive failure. It doesn't mean I have to go back to biting my nails. I'm going to cut myself some slack and create some integrity or like create some space for myself. And then the work that we just did is now about future casting who I'm becoming. And so I think that they're both incredibly important pieces, but it's all tools of self-talk that don't allow you to spiral down into, I'm just a bad person. I apparently lack self-discipline. I'm going to be a nail biter for the rest of my life, and that's just who I am. Like, I'm taking control back and allowing myself to speak to myself in a way that will create the outcome I ultimately want. And so, again, my identity doesn't have me. I have my identity.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to realize there's going to be steps of this. You might have to work at it a couple times to get to the point where you are casting the narrative forward that you want. Let's use a hypothetical example really quick, which if you're an introvert listening, you probably have said this at some point to yourself. I could see an introvert saying, I'm really nervous and bad in social situations and no one likes to talk to me. Like that could be like a way you define yourself. Or I'm really awkward and shy in social situations, and I don't like to go out because I'm so awkward and shy in social situations. You've just identified or defined yourself as somebody that's shy and awkward before you even gone out that night.
Or even slightly less less about the self and more about a thing around the self, but I hate small talk.
Sure.
I've heard that so many times. I hate small talk. So that doesn't really feel like an identifier, but it is. I hate small talk is you identifying yourself as somebody who hates small talk. So I'm going to throw that in there because I think I've heard that one more than just about anything else.
So which one do you want to deal with? We could do some work around, like hypothetical work around this. Just to give another example, which one do you think is better, small talk or shy and nervous in social situations?
Let's do shy and nervous in the same, I think the same principles would apply to the I hate small talk.
Okay. So if you find yourself saying, I'm shy and nervous in social, I can't say this for some reason, social situations, it's a lot of S sounds, that is a very static statement. It's a very definingly static, you're saying this is who I am and this is who I will be no matter what. So how can we start to see this in a more plastic way? Again, you could use the technique of, it's my perception of myself that I show up shy and nervous in social situations. So you've already loosened it up to say, it's not empirically true that you are this thing, it's that you perceive yourself as this way. So that's one step that probably will help you a lot. If you just do a lot of stuff in your life, it helps you loosen up your mind around the definition of how you're defining yourself. So let's take that another step further. How can you, because it might be true. I mean, some of this, when I say it might be true, I put that in air quotes, but there might have been experiences that you've had in your life where you have shown up to social situations. Maybe every single time you've shown up to a social situation, you have been very shy and a little bit awkward. And so you're defining yourself based on the things that have happened or your perception of have happened. And now you're casting that into going out tonight. That's going to be your experience you can expect based on past experiences. So you could phrase it something like, the next step up from my perception is that I'm shy and nervous in social situations is you could say something, it's a little like the next step up is, in the past, I've been shy and nervous in social situations, and I'm becoming more empowered and conversational as each day passes. So you're now recognizing you're separating out this more static nature and you're putting it behind you to say, this is what I have been in the past, but here's where I'm heading toward in the future. And then if you take that concept of the eternal now, that there actually really is no past, it's just a bunch of wires in your brain that have told you there's a past, the reality of the past doesn't exist in the present moment except in your mind. So you could, through your mental work, get to a place where you don't take into the past at all. You reinvent yourself this very moment and make statements about your future, about the positive place you want to go. You say, I am becoming more empowered each social interaction, each day when I talk to people. And at first you might go out and say, man, I feel like I'm lying to myself. This doesn't feel or resonate at the deepest core of my being of who I am. But play with this, cast that narrative. Again, that's a better narrative than what you had that I'm shy and awkward in social situations, to say, I am continually getting better at social situations, interactions each day of my life. And that might be like 0.0001%. Maybe normally if you're out, you'd say hi to one person, and today you said hi to two people. You've increased your sociability. You've increased what you're going toward to become more outgoing and more sociable and connecting with people in the outside world. So it's not necessarily about shifting it. Just because you shifted your statement in your mind doesn't mean the behavior has to shift as drastically, because I can tell that's like the next fear I'm sure people have. Oh God, I gotta now behave so radically different. It could just be increasing it by certain tiny amounts, but that phrase, what you're casting into the world, gives you a target, gives you something to go toward, rather than just being static or having something defining of what you're trying to go away from.
And I think with all of these behaviors, recognizing that, I mean, our behaviors feed into our identity in the same way that our identity feeds into our behaviors. Like, we behave in certain ways based on how we see ourselves. So I don't want to create any sort of like synthetic divorcing of those two things. But that said, the behaviors are not our complete identity. They are a marker of how we see ourselves. They're a marker, like they're part of the emergent of the system running. But if you over-identify with the behaviors, if you call your behaviors your identity, then you miss how much that they're actually just pointing towards the identity. And they can fuel into it. They can add more fuel and nourishment to the identity. And if it's nourishing something that is not something you particularly want, like you don't like that behavior, you don't want it to be now like going back into the identity piece, then maybe you do need to create at least a temporary separation, because our behaviors are a part of how we end up seeing ourselves. And at the same time, they're not the full picture or the whole story. So creating a little bit of separation, a little bit of space, and going back to just the identity, the self-talk part, the systems running, including things like typology and other pieces of who you are. And then noticing that these behaviors are just markers of that. They're just emergence of it, which can, again, fuel back into it. But if the behaviors start to change, it's because your identity started to change. You created a more plastic frame in your identity. And so by definition, now the behaviors start to change. And then as the behaviors change, even if they're incremental, they will continue to fuel back into your identity. So they have a really symbiotic relationship with each other, but you can for a moment separate them just so that you don't over-identify with the behavior. If you're over-identifying with the behavior as your full identity, then you do need to take a moment to separate them out and see how they're distinct from each other. Then, of course, put them back together because they are symbiotic. They will impact each other. But for a moment, you can separate them if you need to get some space from the behavior and go, that's not who I am.
I think it's a great point. You know, as we're talking, the one thing that comes up for me as far as, like, I've realized that in the last 3 months, because I've been doing this work for a while, but in the last 3 months, I've really changed how I talk about typology even. So specifically, often I'll find myself saying right now, I currently identify as an ENFP. I don't use the phrase I'm an ENFP very much. So now sometimes on the podcast to be very, have a convictive voice or a very powerful stance about something. So you listening will take it serious. If you speak all the time in tenuous nature and terms, especially if you're in a leadership position, people may not follow as well, because you have to project a sense of certainty for people to want to follow what you say. But really, I see my very type in this plasticity as well now. I say I currently identify as an ENFP. And you might be really attached to your type listening, especially if you're attracted to personality types or personality hacker in specifics because of typology. I'm an ENTJ or I'm an INFP or I'm a whatever, quote unquote, you are. That might be something you're really identifying with. That's your identity is caught up in that to some degree. And that's something that you could play with, just to say, I currently identify as an ENTJ, or I currently identify as an ISFJ, or whatever your type is. That could be something you can loosen up as well, because ultimately, like we talked about at the very beginning, 7 billion people at the time of this recording on the planet. Not all of them fit nicely into all 16 types. Now, there's some tendencies and trajectories, and that's a map to look at all of us together as social creatures, but we all are our unique individual expressions of ourselves. And so even in the type community, there's a lot of this over-identification with what type you are, and also projecting onto other people. Well, they're a this type, that makes them an a-hole, or this makes them really compassionate because they're this type. And we do this all the time. And loosening that language up of that definition, I think, is really important for us to start taking control of identifying who we are ourselves, not by the labels or the behavior or the history or our past or our culture has put onto us. So I think these concepts are something you can play with in your life, and we would love to hear about how much mileage you get out of some of these ideas. What do you think? We'd love to hear your voice. We've been talking here on these two microphones. You don't have a microphone on your side, but you do have our website where you can leave a comment or ask a question. If you go over to personalityhacker.com, find this podcast and be a part of the conversation. We want to hear your stories, your personal stories, your experiences, your questions, your comments, your thoughts around these topics of how do you identify yourself? How do you define who you are in the world? Is it something that you've just kind of mindlessly gone through? Or is it something you're really proactive about doing? I want to hear from you. Antonia wants to hear from you. Our community wants to hear from you. And speaking of the community, if you want to join a community of like minds, people that are very similar to you, they're thinking in terms of learning maps and models, social technologies, applying them to their lives in order to grow and become the best version of themselves and interface with other people in the best way possible. Head over to facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack. Those are great formats, great communities for you to be a part of the conversation that is ongoing outside of just these podcasts.
Yeah, I need an emery board. I'm going to chew my nails to the nub.
You just keep chewing as I talk, weren't you?
It feels so good.
You're like, this has been like a week or two.
No. It's been like a month. No, I need an emery board to get back into my good habit. So I need to add.
So there's a leverage point of a tool you need.
And also, I need to make sure that my nails are clipped before we do podcasts because I am literally trapped behind this microphone. And all I can think about is I could stop this if I had an emery board. But I'm stuck here. So maybe I just need to have like all my tools for nails every time we podcast. I'm going to remember that as a leverage point.
Okay.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you would do us a favor, you can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. It helps us out a lot.
Yeah. My name is Joel Markwitt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. We can't wait to talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.